Thank you all so much for joining us on our second Mind Readers Book Club discussion. I'm very excited to be here for this event this evening, which is co-sponsored by the Madison Public Library. We will be speaking with author Dr. Michelle Braun about her book titled High-Octane Brain. So I'm Nathaniel Chen, ADRC and RAP Medical Director, and I'm very excited to introduce our wonderful moderator and our very exciting author today. So Dr. Michelle Braun trained at Harvard and Yale and is a board-certified neuropsychologist and a national leader in the field of brain health and cognitive functioning. She is a former instructor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and assistant director of inpatient mental health at the Boston Veterans Administration Hospital. She has been interviewed as a brain health expert on Fox Morning News, CBS, iHeartRadio, and her work has been featured in national media outlets such as Family Circle, Medical Daily, HealthNewsDigest.com, and multiple newspapers. Her popular blog on brain health and psychology today has more than 200,000 views, and she has been an invited speaker for the Alzheimer's Association for the past 14 years. Dr. Braun is also a fellow Wisconsinite. She is practicing neuropsychology at Ascension Medical Group in Racine, Wisconsin. Dr. Braun joined me for the Dementia Matters podcast, and a link to that discussion will be posted in the chat box if you're interested in listening. And please do, it was fascinating, and it will not be the same material as tonight. And our wonderful moderator for this discussion is Dr. Lindsey Clark. Now, Dr. Clark is an assistant professor in the Division of Geriatrics and Gerontology in the Department of Medicine. As a licensed neuropsychologist specializing in geriatrics, Dr. Clark provides diagnostic assessments, treatment planning, and supportive counseling in the UW memory clinics and follow-up clinics. Now, I've had the great pleasure of working with her at our own UW Health Memory Clinic until she left to do bigger and greater things in the research field. I'd also like to mention that she serves as a staff neuropsychologist still in the Madison VA Grec Tele Neuropsychology Service and Cognitive Care Clinic. She's an investigator with the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center and the Wisconsin Registry for Alzheimer's Prevention RAP study, and she supports the ADRC Neuropsychology Service. Now, Dr. Clark provides continuing medical education to clinicians on topics in geriatric neuropsychology and clinical instruction to neuropsychology and psychology trainees. You two have really exhausted me with your bios and your introductions. So let me then move on and say it's my pleasure to introduce you both, Dr. Braun and Dr. Clark, to discuss High-Octane Brain, 5 science-based steps to sharpen your memory and reduce your risk of Alzheimer's. Dr. Clark, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Nate. I am so excited to be here as well with all of you and with Dr. Braun. I just think this is such an excellent topic and just so timely for us to be discussing tonight. And I am really pumped to learn more about what Dr. Braun has to share with us tonight. I know we received a few questions in advance from some of the Mind Reader members, so I'll be going through some of those. I have a few questions, and as you all are listening to Dr. Braun talk, please put your questions into the Q&A box that you should see at the bottom of your screen, and I'm happy to share those. And hopefully we'll get to everyone's questions about brain health and healthy living and reducing risk for Alzheimer's disease as we go through our discussion this hour. So thanks again, Michelle, for being here tonight. I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Yes, thank you. And thanks to Dr. Chin, and thank you also to Erin Chin for all she's done to make this happen.
All right, so why don't we kind of get started with a little bit of a general question here. Can you tell us a little bit about what kind of initially motivated you to write this book and some of the things that you learned most from it as you were researching and writing?
Sure. Well, I reflect back a little bit to finishing my postdoctoral fellowship in neuropsychology in that moment where we actually have our first couple of patients and our first few weeks of practice when we're actually putting into our daily life what we've been taught. And I remember very early on seeing a couple of patients come in who had concerns about memory. And one of them in particular, who still stands out to me, She was a woman in her 60s, and she put a bunch of supplements out on my desk and asked whether she should be taking these for brain health. And so I look at that experience, and at that time I was reflecting on all of the science-based strategies that I wanted to share with her. And I bookend that a little bit with a recent experience I had in a local drugstore, where literally last week I saw someone buying a memory supplement. And so over this many years, that desire for a supplement, for something to help with memory, is not only remaining strong, but it's growing, especially as our older adult population is growing. And so, as we know directly, and as a lot of people in our field know, there's so much out there that is pseudoscientific. And so I really wanted to help empower folks to understand how to distinguish between things that truly will help to maximize brain health and minimize the risk of Alzheimer's, and those things that really are not going to benefit them quite as much, because as we know, time is the most precious thing we have. And if we can start our brain health journey knowing what we should focus on and what can give us the best benefit we're looking for, that can be very powerful. So that was really the motivation, was seeing in that very tangible way that question emerge. And that question has, as I'm sure you have experienced, come up thousands of times and continues to. And so helping people kind of navigate that, I think, was a main desire and motivation behind the book.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree that there's just so much out there for people. It's hard to know what's evidence-based, what's not as evidence-based, and what should people really be doing that it will actually improve their brain and actually help them to, potentially reduce their risk for Alzheimer's disease or other dementias. So I completely understand having that like tangible thing that is sort of a guide, was definitely something that the field needed. And I think that hopefully our other, our readers kind of enjoyed and felt was needed as well. Can you tell us a little bit about, your kind of decisions about tell us a little bit about, I guess, what is, the high-octane brain, and some of the evidence that you found for the different lifestyle factors, like what really helps brain health as you were sort of sifting through all the research, and how did you use that data to inform the Excels method that you describe in your book?
Yeah, so I came to define a high-octane brain based on, and it was an evolving definition, as you're mentioning, based on a lot of research, as your personal best level of brain health. And so I think that that's an empowering and realistic definition, because it takes into account our genetic factors, which of course we come into the world with. We're kind of preloaded with those. It takes into account any lifestyle experiences that we've had that may have impacted our brain health. So that, for example, takes into account educational level. It takes into account the level of enrichment of our early environment. It takes into account potentially if we had something deleterious happen to our brain, if we had, for example, a traumatic brain injury. In other words, it's sort of all encompassing in its scope, and it allows for that marriage of the genetic factors plus any of the events that have occurred. And then on top of that says that despite what those other factors are, and what's great is the research shows this really clearly, even for example, if someone has a strong genetic risk for Alzheimer's, that those lifestyle factors can enhance, or in some cases be a negative impact on the future trajectory. So I think of the high-octane brain as our future brain, our what we're really aspiring to, and that's an ongoing process that all of us are on a trajectory right now. And then the question is, how do we max that trajectory? And so that's where the high-octane brain is in terms of our goal. And we can differentiate that from, we can think of that as synonymous with optimal brain health. And we can differentiate that from two other trajectories. One would be the trajectory that most people follow, which is that of normal aging. And the other would be the trajectory of accelerated aging. in which we might see neurodegenerative processes like Alzheimer's or other neurological diseases. And I think it's an important point to make that if an individual does have Alzheimer's or mild cognitive impairment, that it is not a reflection of something they've done wrong. That doesn't mean that they haven't implemented lifestyle factors or that in any way they're to blame for the illness that they have. In fact, what we often see is a lot of folks who have very healthy lifestyles may delay the onset of those memory problems, sometimes by a decade or more, because they were really engaging in those healthy lifestyle factors. So we can imagine that optimal trajectory of the high-octane brain then is reachable by engaging in the 5 steps of the Excels method. And in the book, to make a little bit of a play on words and try to engage a little bit with what we know about motivational psychology, Excels, like let's excel, let's maximize our trajectory. So the 5 steps there, the EX in Excel stands for exercise, which is predominantly the research now supports cardiovascular exercise, although there's a great emerging body of research in other types. The C in Excel is for consume healthy food. The E is for engage and learn. The L is for lower stress to boost well-being. And then the S is sleep for better brain health. So as you mentioned, there's so many possible factors we could focus on. By adding kind of a rubric and an ordering there based on the strength of the research, that I hope provides a bit of a roadmap so that people feel like they know where to start and how to ignite the biggest return on their investment of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I really liked how some of the factors kind of build on some of the others so they can be kind of synergistic with one another too. I think that can be really helpful for people when they're trying to kind of get this going. Very cool. Can you tell us a little bit more? I kind of want to talk a little bit about that cognitive engagement piece, the engage and learn. And also, I know we got some questions initially about diet, specific kind of diet related questions. So maybe we'll kind of start there and just kind of dig into those 2 areas, if that sounds good to you.
Sure.
One of the things I really appreciated in your book, because I get a lot of questions about this, was your really nuanced discussion of the evidence on brain games and, kind of those crosswords or brain games or tools that you can use to really help with, or that people want to know about if they can help to improve their brain health. Tell us a little bit more about, as you're researching this book, what you learned about the evidence for or against brain games and whether you typically now recommend these for people as part of their brain health program.
Mm-hmm. As you said, I think that's one of the leading questions that we get in our field. And I think the reason for that partially is because brain games are pretty obviously connected to memory if we look at them. Right, we're doing a crossword. That means we are exercising our word usage. We do a puzzle that tests our ability to pay attention to information. Therefore, my attention must get better. So there's what appears to be on the surface, this really clear link between what I'm doing and the impact of that. And I think that link then can be misleading because it can suggest falsely to people that that's the best thing that they could do for their cognitive functioning. But it's not like, I guess the analogy would be if we were lifting a weight, we would see our bicep grow bigger. So that makes sense that we would have that connection between a physical action and expecting a result. But it's a little bit different with the brain. And so there really is not strong evidence at all for most online brain game platforms. And it may be a surprise to folks to know that a couple of them had unfortunately had lawsuits levied against them because of some of the claims that were made. And so the biggest question we always want to ask ourselves about an online brain game platform or any cognitive exercise we're doing is the question of generalizability. In other words, does what I'm doing here actually transfer to giving me better memory in daily life? So for example, if I'm drilling my memory, does that mean I'll remember someone's name better that I meet in a conversation? And the answer to that, unfortunately, is often no when we think about online brain games. We think of that as they lack that transfer to daily life, which is why people are doing them in the first place. So that becomes a challenge. And so there is one platform that does have some support, and I have no relationship to this platform at all, aside from looking at the research, and that is the brainhq.com platform, which has different analogs and their consumer profile to the games that have been done in longitudinal memory studies, where there has been some of that generalizability has been shown. And so if individuals really want to do online brain games, then I do recommend they look at that platform in particular. I also really try to clarify that a brain game itself is only one of multiple strategies, and that if we look at the relative strength of the research, having a little bit of activity on brain game is great, but I'd much rather see some of that activity also being in cardiovascular exercise, in the brain healthy diet, in sleep if possible, especially because relative research support for the exercise, especially in the diet, are very strong. So that's usually the biggest discussion we have is you can do the brain games if you really like to, they're not necessary. I think that's another important point. We can talk about other things that individuals might want to do in lieu of brain games, but we probably have this shared experience where people come in and they say, I'm doing crosswords for 3 hours a day. And then you're asking that question, is that 3 hours better spent, part of it doing the crosswords, but a larger part of it doing the cardiovascular exercise and then the diet itself too. So there's unfortunately more and more of those platforms are popping up. So it's a really great time for us to have this discussion. And I think it's empowering for people to know that you can enhance your brain health with everyday things that you enjoy doing, as long as you make them slightly challenging, you add variety, you make sure that there's something that you enjoy. So we do not want to force people to do brain games, especially if they don't enjoy them.
Right, which can be helpful for people who are trying to just like do something online or do a crossword and they're miserable doing it. And they just, there's so many other things that it sounds like you can do. Are there particular recommendations that come up often for people when you're talking about, cognitive engagement or that you see really work well for people?
Yeah, I love to personalize that. So I will often say, what do you love to do? What are some of your favorite hobbies? And if somebody loves gardening, for example, we might talk about how they could increase the complexity of the gardening that they're doing by adding different plant species or by researching other new species that they're not aware of, or by looking at gardening in different countries, for example. So taking that thread of interest and then magnifying it and maximizing it is one way, but we always want to have variety. So adding other areas as well can be really important. So I think starting with that kernel of what gives you joy and interests you, because that's much more likely to be something you want to go back and do. That's, I think, a big problem that we see in any behavior change, is that if we don't follow that kernel of inherent interest that someone has, it becomes a habit, quote unquote, that kind of goes away really quickly. So that's one strategy. But I also like to point out that if you look at the types of strategies that have been done by the nuns in the nun study and a lot of the other longitudinal studies, they were out doing all kinds of fun stuff. So they were out going to museums, learning new languages, learning new recipes. Some of them were becoming animal keepers. Some of them were farmers. In other words, there really was no limit on the type of task they could do in order to get that brain benefit. And that also includes things like having a stimulating conversation is a brain game. Watching a movie that you then kind of think through critically is a brain game, so to speak. So when we talk in kind of that more expansive way about all of the things that can be enriching to the brain, people get excited because they don't feel like they're into that restrictive area, like it has to be a crossword or it has to be something online.
Absolutely. It makes it easier to get started in something, I would imagine, and like sustain it over time, as you mentioned, if it's something that is something that you enjoy doing and it's not just like something you're forcing yourself to do for your health. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's so helpful. So thanks for going through all of that. I also wanted to talk a bit about diet, because I think that's a big one. You mentioned the person who brought supplements, to the appointment. I think we get a lot of questions about what kinds of supplements should people be on? Are supplements helpful? And we don't talk as much about what we eat, I guess, and just kind of the general our diet. But that's completely, we can also get nutrients from the things that we eat in just our kind of day-to-day life. So I wanted to just have you kind of talk a little bit more about some of the unique aspects of the mind diet, which is what from your research showed is kind of the most evidence-based for brain health. And maybe kind of just remind us a little bit about that evidence base, maybe refresh us a little bit on some of the unique aspects of that diet compared to other diets, and why we might recommend this over, supplements or other things.
Sure. So one of my favorite parts of the book was interviewing 8 brain health researchers and really getting the kind of behind the scenes from each of them as to where they saw the field going, what inspired them to do their work. And so one of my favorite interviews was with Dr. Martha Claire Morris, who was the founder of the Mind Diet. And she and her team had studied it extensively, and it is undergoing currently a randomized clinical trial to look at its effectiveness. And what I love about the Mind Diet and why I highlighted it so prominently is that it has as its backbone the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet. So it kind of takes the best of both of those diets, but then it also augments that with specific pieces that are directly focused on brain health. So and it really, of the 3, is the only one that was expressly created for maximizing brain health. The Mediterranean diet, being a cultural diet, has been around for a long time, and it was kind of incidentally discovered that helped brain health, like it helps cardiovascular health, for example. The DASH diet similarly was developed for hypertension control. So it was only in that context then that people went, wow, this actually impacts brain health too. And that's interesting. That's a whole nother level of interesting findings that come from that. But because the Mind Diet was expressly from the very beginning set out to become a brain health diet, it really focused on a level of practicality that stood out to me as being very different. So for example, in the Mind Diet, the people who participated in the research studies were broken up into tertiles. So 3 groups, those who followed it at a low level, a medium level, and a high level. The people who followed it at that highest level, which by the way, wasn't too taxing or time consuming, had over 4 years of 53% reduced risk of Alzheimer's, which was pretty astounding. Now that's very consistent with the Mediterranean diet statistics for that same amount of time. But if you have partial compliance with the Mind Diet, if you move down to that second tertile, for example, over 4 years, which is much more practical even, you still have a 35% reduced risk of Alzheimer's. That ability to get a response from a partial compliance drops away with Mediterranean and DASH. So you're sort of held to a much stricter level of compliance with those diets to really get the brain health benefit. And, as behavioral scientists who are really trying to make this come alive for people, that just didn't seem quite as practical. So that was the first piece that led me to highlight it. The second piece was that the Mind Diet has a couple of foods that stand out as power foods that have individually been studied, and that I think, again, allow people to say, I don't have time to overhaul my diet, but I can add a couple of these foods that are really going to give me benefit. So the favorite one I like to mention is the dark green leafy vegetables, because the stats on that compared to other foods are pretty astounding. So people who had just 1 serving a day of dark green leafy vegetables over 10 years had an 11-year slowing of their cognitive aging, which is pretty amazing. So in other words, if you can't do all of the pieces, have that one serving a day of the dark green leafy, or berries, similarly, looking at about a 5 to 6 year slowing for 2 to 3 servings a week. So I felt from the practicality standpoint that it really stood out. And I also love the idea that it has been integrated as the diet of choice into the US Pointer study of the Alzheimer's Association. So there was a wonderful randomized controlled trial done a few years ago called the Finger Study, which was amazing for our field. It really created much more of an evidence base for these factors, these lifestyle factors. And the Alzheimer's Association is now running a similar study in the United States, and they've chosen the MIND diet as their intervention for that reason as well. I will highlight that Mediterranean diet, DASH diet, they do have randomized controlled trial support, which is that higher level of scientific support that we look for to say that there is a causal effect. The MIND diet still, because it's relatively newer, again, is undergoing that randomized controlled trial. So a lot of that research is more correlational, but it's very promising. It's very strong.
Yeah. And it makes a lot of sense to try to have something where you don't have to completely overhaul your diet, but just adding a few things here and there. At least personally, I think that can be a little bit more feasible, more like palatable for people than kind of trying to do something totally different.
Right. And as you said too, it's such a great question about the supplements, because there is so much of a focus. I kind of make the analogy that a supplement is a little bit like a brain game, in that it's this tangible thing that seems like it has this cause and effect action on your brain. And it really is, related to the medical lens in which we view the world to some extent. Like if you take a pill, you have a physical effect. And probably surprisingly to a lot of people, unless someone is actually nutrient deficient, which is something that can be looked at through lab tests, there really has been no support for supplements. And that means even fish oil supplements, even multivitamins when it comes to brain health. So, it's sort of surprising, and it really upends our ideas about what contributes to brain health. But for folks who are more interested in learning a little bit more about that, in the book, what I did was I summarized a lot of the bigger pieces of research that came from medical committees. So at the various World Health Organization, there have been a number of brain health committees that have come together, partially because that supplement industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry that's just burgeoning.
Oh, that's so helpful, because there's so much marketing around these supplements, and many of them are marketed specifically for memory or specifically for brain health. And I really think it's extremely difficult for people to know what evidence there is for these. So I think it's really, I'm glad to hear that you've kind of provided some of that information in your book, and can provide an alternative to supplements through a more, evidence-based approach, using something like the MIND diet and these other things like exercise and stress reduction and sleep and cognition.
Mm-hmm.
So I know there was a question that came in or a couple questions that came in related to diet. So I want to jump into those here. One is it true that you eat handfuls of spinach due to their health benefit? I think you had mentioned that in the book.
Well, one of the things that I think about in terms of how the book impacted me, and delving into these research studies and these conversations with researchers more and more, was in regard to the dark green leafy vegetables. I always have known they're healthy, but in study after study, seeing the really strong benefits, I said, well, I have to, make these more of a consistent part of my diet too, especially if I'm talking about it. So for years, I've had a smoothie in the morning that has dark green leafy vegetables with a bunch of other nutrients. And I started to then actually supplement that with dark green leafy vegetables at night. And so, yes, if I have not had time to put it into a salad or a dish, then I will eat like one half of a handful of spinach, not handfuls, multiple. But I think of it kind of like a nutrient bullet. I mean, spinach and dark green leafy vegetables, those sometimes take a little time to prepare or to make them taste good. And so it doesn't take long. It takes like 30 seconds to just put it together and eat it.
Just shove it down.
Yeah, pretty much.
It's going to my brain.
Yeah, I mean, that's the epitome of the supplement, right? It's and what I love about that is that there are your antioxidants. I mean, that's like really powerful. The impact of the antioxidants, especially on the free radicals. And so I went into a lot of detail on the way that those components interact in a talk that we did on nutrition. So if folks are interested in learning more about that, I'm happy to talk about that more tonight, or you can kind of look at that presentation as well. But it's an amazing sort of synergy and balance and internal war sort of that's going on. And you're kind of dosing yourself against oxidation essentially when you do that.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully we can put a link up, Erin, to the to Dr. Braun's other talk about nutrition too, in case people do want to be able to see more information about the specific nutrition details too. There was another question related to this that came in. For the people who frequently added the dark leafy vegetables and fruits, are the benefits potentially derived by the foods that were left out because of the addition of these superfoods? So this is a really good question, I think, about the effectiveness of the MIND diet. Is it possible that do we know for sure that this is because of the foods that are coming in as a part of the MIND diet, like the leafy greens and the berries? Or is it that people are replacing other foods that were maybe bad for the brain or bad for brain health when they're doing this?
Mm-hmm. That's a fantastic question. I mean, I don't know that the data looked necessarily at how the serving sizes of the desired foods perhaps mapped on to decreasing the serving sizes of foods that we know, according to the MIND diet, can be brain deflators. But I think that we can take some information from other studies as well that have controlled that more. The beauty of the MIND diet is it looked at a variety of foods. But when we look at research studies that isolate out the nutritional factors from dark green leafy vegetables, from berries, we still see that association. In fact, that's actually why Dr. Martha Claire Morris targeted those foods to add. So when she talked about the development of the MIND diet, she poured over research, extending from animal studies to human studies, et cetera, looking at those individual foods and said, let's add these because there's a lot of data that independently supports them. So I think we can be fairly confident that those foods in and of themselves have strong value for brain health.
Great. And another kind of specific question about diet is, what is your opinion on coffee fruit extract for the prevention of Alzheimer's? And can you explain what that is to a non-coffee drinker?
Sure. So coffee fruit extract. So on the coffee plant are berries that grow that look a little bit like grapes. They can be shaded red or green. And it's inside that little fruit, which could be called a coffee berry or a coffee cherry, that you see the pit, which is what we know of as a coffee bean. And so there's been some interesting research looking at the nutritional impact on the brain of the coffee berry. And so that's what a coffee berry is. There was one study that actually showed that having increased coffee berry consumption was leading to, or correlated with, we should say, a rise in what we think of as a growth hormone in the brain called BDNF, which is called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which I talk a lot about in the chapter on exercise. But it was an isolated finding, and currently there has not been replication of that finding. But I do want to draw back the idea to the fact that a coffee berry or coffee cherry is high in antioxidants. And so that again supports this idea that we're talking about with the dark green leafy vegetables and antioxidants in general, that we know that they're health promoting, and not just for the brain, but for decreased aging, cellular aging overall. So I kind of look at what is that common denominator, and it's the antioxidant.
Mm-hmm. I really love in your book that you talk about, the evidence base with kind of these clinical trials, but also really how things impact the brain structure or, the neurons themselves, or, the brain actually changes because of a lot of these lifestyle factors that people can engage in. And it also, one question I was thinking of, or something that I guess stuck out to me, was when you talked about some of the stories of people, the brain health role models, and a lot of them kind of started these brain health activities a little bit later in life. And that was really inspiring to see. And, I guess I wonder if you could talk a little bit more generally about what some of the brain changes are that can happen with some of these lifestyle factors, either exercise or the diet, or sleep, good sleep, and how it can, if it's similar when, no matter what age you are when you start making these changes.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm so glad you liked that section, that thread through the book of how does X change the physiology of the brain? Because that was, I feel like that's our strongest motivation, where we get that kind of ignition effect for people when they go, really? So when I exercise, I'm actually potentially increasing the density of my hippocampus? Like, I had no idea. So I would love to focus on 3 areas that you were asking about. So we can talk about the brain changes associated with cardiovascular exercise, then those associated with a brain healthy diet, and then also those associated with better sleep. Because I think those 3 have the strongest, clearer linkages between the physiological changes and the behavior. So first, I could talk forever about this, so I'm going to try to make it brief, but I get so excited about this idea. And I know I've used this analogy before, but I feel like it gives a visualization that is empowering. So I wanted to just invite everybody to hold up your thumbs, like in front of you, and curl them slightly, because this is about the size of your hippocampus. And we can imagine that the hippocampus is the switchboard, essentially, where memory information we ultimately remember is initially processed. And so you can imagine that switchboard right now, at this moment, at any moment you're engaging, is getting throttled, with information from multiple sources, and it is traveling in milliseconds and faster than that. So that little curled thumb shaped structure lies about 1.5 inches in towards the center of your head under each ear. And it's sitting there loving to do its job and needing as much growth hormone as possible to do it maximally. And you give it more growth hormone, or miracle growth, so to speak, with cardiovascular exercise. And I'll say that is correlational, but it has been shown across hundreds of studies. And so what I mean by that is that when we raise our heart rate, and preferably into that moderate intensity zone, we have this cascade of benefits that occur that are really specific to the hippocampus. So yes, the whole brain gets more oxygenation, the whole brain gets more circulation, but the density of the tissue doesn't grow in every area. It grows specifically in that hippocampus, and it also grows in the circuitry between the subcortical area and the frontal cortex. I call those 2 areas Park Place and Boardwalk, because if we had, 2 areas that we could influence in our cognitive functioning, we want as much better memory as much as possible, and we also want better decision making, strategy formation. So that's the first thing people have an aha moment with. It's not as if the motor center of the brain has more density to it, et cetera. So again, it is not equally targeting all areas, which is really promising, because the hippocampus is where Alzheimer's typically begins. The other thing I like to point out is that even if an individual doesn't have, memory concerns, there's a lot of research that suggests that proactively being engaged in cardiovascular exercise over time makes the hippocampus more resilient overall. And as you said, the age at which people begin these behaviors doesn't seem to have an impact on how helpful they are. So we see this very helpful impact extend from children all the way up through older adulthood. In fact, one of the studies I highlighted in the book was done with individuals older adults, 60 and older. And that was the initial study that was done by Kirk Erickson and his colleagues that really kind of shifted the field as we think about it. So that's the first area that is really exciting to see that physiological change. The second drives back a little bit to what we talked about before, which is looking at brain tissue and how thick it is. And we can see that individuals who have higher amounts of saturated fat in their diet have more shrinkage in the temporal lobes than individuals who don't. And that's why in the Mind Diet, the 5 foods that are called brain deflators are highlighted as foods we want to try to minimize, because that saturated fat has free radicals that essentially glom onto potentially our neurons in order to become whole molecules. In other words, they're unstable molecules that need another molecule in order to stabilize, and sometimes they bind to healthy tissue. So we know that increasing antioxidants and decreasing that saturated fat equals more of a robust set of temporal lobes, a denser set. The third area with sleep, really fascinating. This is really kind of the newer frontier in our field, which is driving back to this idea that by the time someone develops symptoms of Alzheimer's, it's likely been silently brewing potentially for decades, maybe 3 decades or more. Sleep researchers are really trying to understand how even one night of not getting enough sleep and having insomnia is associated with higher levels of beta amyloid protein. Beta amyloid protein is produced by all of us as a natural metabolic byproduct. In other words, it's a waste material that is produced by our cells as a normal byproduct of what we have to do with our brain for everyday life. Interestingly, some of the newer research in humans, which extends from the animal research, is that when we sleep and we sleep soundly, our brain is sort of turning on a janitorial function. It seems to be coming through and clearing things out, cleaning out the neuronal spaces, flushing out the beta amyloid. And when we interrupt that cycle repeatedly because we're getting up, you can see more beta amyloid deposition. It's not getting cleared away to the degree that it is if we sleep soundly. That is not cause for concern if somebody is not sleeping for, a night or 2 nights. But the idea is over time that could potentially be a risk factor that's leading to a cascade then that puts someone more at risk. So those are 3 really concrete brain structure changes that we know are directly related to our behavior.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you. That's so helpful to, really understand how these behaviors actually do impact the changes that are happening in our brains as we get older, and can really help us to be potentially more resilient to changes of Alzheimer's disease. One of the questions that came in now is going to shift gears a little bit, I think, towards how do we actually implement some of these behavioral changes and get engaged in them and sustain these changes. So I'm going to ask this question specifically. How does Dr. Braun approach a caregiver who is struggling to help his or her partner from engaging in healthy behaviors due to apathy or lack of motivation?
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great question, because that's a reality that we really have to take into consideration. And so one of my areas that I typically explore is whether that individual who we want to engage, and usually I try to simplify it. If an individual has Alzheimer's, then if we look at the strength of the behavioral strategies, it really is then that cardiovascular exercise rises to the top. So we don't have, if we think of the relative support, we could think cognitive engagement and social engagement are also helpful. But unfortunately, the diet piece kind of drops away a little bit more at that point. We don't really have a great body of support for the impact of diet in Alzheimer's that's been diagnosed. And we also don't have as much support overtly for the stress management piece. So I like to focus on, okay, if we are going to try to shift one thing, let's maybe aim for the physical piece. And so oftentimes if it's an overt request, like let's exercise or let's go out and do X, that resistance, that apathy it tends to be a more of a barrier than a backdoor approach where, for example, I'll say to a caregiver, would you like to go out for a walk, and then ask them to just join you? Or would you have, like to take a ride? A lot of these things happen then in the process of doing other activities that are not advertised as exercise. So taking a ride to a park and then just getting out and looking at a tree that happens to just be, a quarter of a mile down the path. So things like that are utilized in a way where you're capitalizing on things that a person enjoys. So another thing that sometimes can be helpful is to identify what physical hobbies someone had really engaged in more so before, like bowling, for example, or did they like to shoot darts? I mean, it could be any kind of physical activity that the person is, again, engaging in a way that's not overtly exercise. I also find animals to be really helpful in this situation. So having to take care of an animal, or the dog needs you to walk, the dog needs to go for a walk. So it oftentimes, if we flip it from, I want you to do this, to could you come with me? I'd like you to come with me, or I'd like you to do this for the dog, or I want you to do this for our neighbor. Appealing to the desire to help in some cases can be helpful. And then if the apathy gets in the way of that, then bringing that person to another setting can often be helpful too, because sometimes that apathy tends to feed in on itself in familiar settings. And so when that setting is shifted, sometimes you see a little bit more of engagement.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think thinking on that a little bit further, for kind of anyone who's having difficulty getting engaged in doing some of these behavior changes, since behavior change we know is not always easy. Can you tell us a little bit, when you've worked with people on using this method, what are some of the most common barriers or pitfalls that people encounter when starting, kind of on their brain health journey? And do people tend to have more difficulty with one area than others? And how do people sort of stay motivated to continue?
Mm-hmm. So I think that the biggest thing I see is that if we can tweak the expectations that this is a marathon that is in the best possible way, it's something that we need to continue. I sometimes just make the physical analogy again, to something as simple as like brushing our teeth, right? I mean, to have good dental health, we wouldn't expect to not brush our teeth and then for it to be, something we treat with, a medication or something down the road. We expect, as a function of the fact that we can see our teeth, that we need to take care of it every day. And so I think when people recognize that this is a shift that is occurring in a longer term way, similar to that it's not something that's just for the short term, that they engage much more. So that's the biggest barrier I see, is that people think this is kind of like temporary and then I can go back to what I was doing before. And in reality, it's really more so about just tweaking some things, because having a complete overhaul of what we do is not likely. We're much more likely to change in those stages. So that's the biggest discussion we usually have, is setting that expectation for this can be fun. And this is something that if you do this long term, you will reap the benefits. It's also an analogy you can make to investing, right? People are putting money into their, investment accounts on a consistent basis. It's the same thing. You're banking that brain health down the road. In terms of things that help to stoke motivation, I find that role models are really helpful. And that's part of why I really wanted to share a cadre of diverse role models who would potentially speak to people in different ways. And we can see from their stories that they all had different ways, that very unique ways that they went along the brain health journey. And so I also made it a point when I interviewed the experts to talk to them about what is hard for you. You know, you're someone who is doing this for a living. This is your area of expertise that you've devoted your career to. And if you look through some of those interviews, you'll see that folks are saying, you know, it's hard for me to exercise, or it's hard for me to sleep. And so I really wanted to showcase that no one does brain health perfectly, because that's another barrier we often see, is that people think they've got to kind of go at that high level across all 5 of the steps. And so pointing out that progress is, and that's part of where the one change at a time accomplished now equals excellence, the acronym I use for Octane, what I was hoping to impart, this idea that little, you know, eating the little thing of spinach at the end of the day, taking an extra walk, those things do add up. And so those are the biggest hurdles I see, are the, you know, the expectations and about the journey. And then also just feeling like somebody doesn't have the ability to overhaul, and that's not an expectation. So clarifying that is really helpful too.
Absolutely. Those small steps and the little things that you do make a big difference. I know we had a couple questions here. I think about, you know, life things that happened earlier in life. So we had one question about, do farmers and people who worked with pesticides have a higher risk of Alzheimer's disease or dementia? Did any of your research focus at all on pesticides or early life factors that can increase risk?
Yeah, so there's an interesting body of research, and it had culminated in a meta-analysis around 2016, where there were a number of studies looking at pesticide exposure and eventual dementia. And there is an association between pesticide exposure and neurological diagnoses such as Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS. And that has been, you know, a mixed finding prior to that meta-analysis. That meta-analysis did find a fairly strong association. And then subsequently, since 2016, there have been some other studies showing and being exposed to pesticides, or have a loved one who is exposed to pesticides. There's some interesting research looking at specific types of pesticides and risk and exposure. And so talking with a healthcare provider about that specific type of pesticide exposure can be really helpful. But yes, there is some research suggesting that can increase the risk of Alzheimer's. We know that a number of early life factors can really make a big difference. So for example, children who are started in the habit of physical activity early on have a lower risk of Alzheimer's over time. Individuals who have a higher level of education have a lower risk of Alzheimer's. Individuals, interestingly, who have more complex jobs. And so really interesting research looking at what is the nature of your work. Are you solving novel problems, which is associated with having a greater protection against Alzheimer's, or are you implementing the same practices in a repetitive way? And so it's really fascinating to look at those factors. And kind of in a related way, one of the really interesting early life factors in the NUN study was something that we think of as the complexity in the density of writing. So if you look in retrospect at nuns who got Alzheimer's and versus those who didn't, who developed it, and you look at their density of their writing in early life in their teenage years, those who had more complexity to their ideas in the way that they shared information had seemingly a lower risk of Alzheimer's over time. So, you know, the hope is that a lot of what we're talking about now shifts all of us into a proactive setting and helps us shift the youngest members of our society into that proactive stance as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And one question that came in is, if you're already diagnosed with brain decline, can it be reversed? That's a tough question.
Yeah. So there isn't, first of all, it depends on what the reason is for somebody having brain decline. You know, mild cognitive impairment in some cases can revert back to normal cognitive functioning if reversible aspects are detected. And those could be things like medication effects, sleep effects. For example, we see undiagnosed sleep apnea a lot. And then when we get that treatment on board, we see oftentimes a boost in cognitive functioning. If someone does have a vitamin deficiency, a mood-related issue, a metabolic issue, those things we do see some good success generally in reversing. If somebody on the flip side is experiencing perhaps the early symptoms of what ultimately maybe over time a worsening memory problem like Alzheimer's, for example, we don't have consistent evidence. In fact, I'm not aware of any studies that have been ever replicated that show that you can reverse that. But what we can do is slow that down generally for many individuals. So that's what I think where the hope really lies, is that there's a lot of good research suggesting that if someone has mild cognitive impairment and even Alzheimer's, even into the moderate phase of Alzheimer's, that some of these lifestyle factors, in particular in MCI, we're looking particularly at exercise and also at diet and cognitive engagement. In Alzheimer's, again, we're looking predominantly at exercise. So that does shift a little as we move through that. But those techniques have been shown to slow cognitive decline, which is fantastic.
Absolutely. Just even having, a little more time where you have that independence or can do things that are important to you. I mean, that can make a huge difference in people's lives. Yeah, absolutely. Oh my gosh, we're almost out of time here. I'm going to end with two practical, hopefully quick questions.
Sure.
Are any of your worksheets available in PDF form? So I know you have the tracker in the back of your book. And then also, would Dr. Braun please share her smoothie recipe that includes dark green leafy veggies?
Absolutely. So the tracker and the action plan, I unfortunately don't have in PDF. The publisher has those really in the PDF part of the book, which is in the electronic format. So if you were to, for example, get the Kindle version or the electronic version, you get a PDF of those. But unfortunately, I don't actually have even a PDF of those. Those aren't mine anymore. Those are the publishers. But the other piece about the smoothie recipe, so I have to remember, my husband makes this for me every morning. So it's a handful of dark green leafy vegetables, which is usually spinach, sometimes kale. It is, the berries are definitely in there. So it's about a cup of frozen blueberries. There is flaxseed. So there's a tablespoon of flaxseed. There's some green matcha powder in there for an extra boost of energy. The heart of the smoothie is non-fat Greek yogurt. There's also tart cherry juice in there, which is high in antioxidants. There is, I think those are, I'll have to see if there's any other ingredients, but those are the ones that come to mind right now. But the heart of it is all about the antioxidants for the most part.
That sounds amazing. I need to start doing this in the mornings. Thank you so much, Dr. Braun, for joining us this evening. I wish we had more time because I feel like I could talk to you for another hour. This just flew by. I hope this has been helpful for our book club viewers. And remember to check out the Dementia Matters podcast episode with Dr. Braun, or some of the links that Erin put in the chat if you would like to hear more. You can also find things on adrc.wisc.edu/dementia matters. If you're not already a member of our book club, please feel free to register at adrc.wisc.edu/book club. And our next Mind Readers book club discussion is going to be on the book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, which is also an excellent book by author Rebecca Skloot. So I think I will wrap us up there since we're at 7. And thank you so much, Michelle. And thank you so much, Dr. Chin, for the intros. And thanks to everyone for joining us. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your evening and your week.
Thank you so much.